All right, you guys ready? We are. All right. We don't want a hot mic moment. So my name is Brett Littman. I'm the director of the Drawing Center. If you don't mind, I'm going to just take my notes back. So welcome to this evening's presentation. I would ask if you have a phone, could you just turn off the ringer, just because we are going to have readings tonight and some discussion. It would appreciate that. The Drawing Center often hosts events that are unrelated to our exhibition program. And tonight, we're very happy to be able to host the book launch of Seeing Naples, Reports from the Shadows of Vesuvius, which is published by Edgewise Press. And it's a book of travel writing inspired by Daniel's travels in Naples in the 90s, when you had a Fulbright to go to Naples and to live there for, how long were you there?
Well, the grant was for a year, but I actually stayed on and lived in Naples for about 3 years.
3 years, great. I've read the book. It's a wonderful book. There's a copy. The copy's outside, available for $35, and Daniel will sign them, personalize them to you. I really highly recommend it. It's beautifully designed. It includes a lot of historical images and photographs that you've taken, as well as some beautiful topography and layout. So it's really quite a beautiful project. And tonight, we're going to hear a little bit conversation between Richard and Wayne and Daniel about the book. And Daniel's going to read a couple of passages, not in Italian, I asked him, but maybe he'll break into some Italian if he feels comfortable with that. And I think the program will last about 45 minutes, and so enjoy, and thank you very much for coming. Appreciate it.
I'm Richard Milazzo. This is Wayne Koestenbaum, and that's Daniel to his right. Maybe what we should do is, Daniel, do you want to start by some opening remarks about the book? And then either Wayne or I could follow.
Certainly. Well, first of all, welcome to this book launch. And Seeing Naples is a project that has such an interesting long gestation period. I had come back to New York in the early 90s, and I used to discuss my time in Naples with John Ash, an English poet who encouraged me to write about my experiences. And I would write these essays, and he would critique them. And that's how the book was born, and somehow over the course of 25 years I continued to write essays, and it became not only personal narrative, but also I began to interpret episodes of historical and cultural importance to the city of Naples. And I also worked on portraits of interesting Neapolitans and recalled interesting dialogues with people that I met. So, and it was, as Wayne pointed out, also a tonic for me living in New York City, where in Naples it was so on the edge, and back here it was interesting to reflect on such a completely different kind of parallel reality. But it didn't actually become a book until 2 years ago. I mean, it was a collection of essays. It was a book. But I was hoping to see it published, and I sent it around for endorsements. And one of the people to whom I sent it was Richard Milazzo. And to my utter delight, he decided he immediately said he wanted to publish the book, which was a great honor, something I never expected could happen. And then over the course of 2 years, Richard designed the book. We would meet at Hasaki, a Japanese restaurant in the East Village, and I would do the layout, and Richard would do the book design. And this column moves over a millimeter, and I would. So it was a very long, design process. But Richard has such a refined sensibility as a book designer, and it's just been a great pleasure. Maybe, Richard, you want to speak to the resurrection of Neapolitan typeface.
Well, he's giving me the easy topic. No, but actually, I thought, Wayne, would you like to say something before I go ahead?
Yes, I'm the newcomer here, I think, since I've only known Daniel for a few years, and I've only been to Naples once. but I am a writer, and I'm a particular fan of ruminative, unclassifiable prose projects. And what I love about Daniel's work across media is, in one sense, its undefinability and uncategorizability, and also its privacy, I think. It's his work in every medium is ceremonial, economical in its gestures, and retrospective, and to some extent also with a wish to reanimate. I think that he's always, I think, in the seance business. So when he showed me this book, he was very modest about it. Didn't claim writer status, but it was immediately apparent to me that it was very well crafted, very soberly crafted, in fact. Not like much personal writing or travel writing, overstuffed with impressions. It's a very laconic book, in fact, and it focuses on certain representative personages he encountered in his time in Naples, certain features of Naples history, but it's very selective, and it has a kind of tone of both a bird's eye view of the history of Naples and something written by an extraterrestrial visitor. So, I mean, I haven't seen Our Town maybe ever, but let's just imagine that famous scene from Our Town, and Daniel is like visiting, I would say, is it asynchronic would be the word, a Naples, a palimpsest of Naples across all its historical incarnations, and he has maybe a half an hour to make a few select ritual visits, and that's what the book is. And it's haunted, I think, very much by Benjamin's travel essays. I don't think that the burden in Daniel's work is Marxist particularly. It might be a little bit. It's certainly Jewish in a beautifully, Judaism is always passé, isn't that the whole thing about it? But it's, I'm very impressed, both in Daniel's first book, which is, what's the exact title of the book on Jewish
metaphysics as generative principle in American art.
Yeah, he teases out the kind of spiritual Judaic undersong in a tradition of abstract American art. And he does a similar thing with Naples. He delicately moves toward Jewry at the end, in a secular way to some extent, but like a true collector. I think Daniel is at heart a collector of postcards, glimpses, refusals. It's a laminated and very delicate book.
Beautiful. I just want to add one little thing to that. If it's unimaginable to me that, given all that Wayne has just said, which makes the book look extremely synthetical and coherent, the book actually occurred over, how many years, 25?
25 years,
25
and 2 years of design.
I think we're seeing here a case of Daniel being traumatized by my design demands, but I think it's extraordinary that these, something I described in here as the epic fragments came together across a quarter of a century, and that's another way of thinking about 25 years. And I think that's significant because it reveals a kind of ethos, a working ethos that Daniel has as a human being, and a kind of ideological inner core that is more spiritual. And I think the word you were looking for would be, the way I describe Daniel, as a kind of Jewish Buddhist. And so instead of communist, I would say, or ideological per se, I would say he has a Buddhist sensibility, and so that really comes out in his patience and his sensibility. But I don't want to go on too much because I have this pathological paper I want to read in a little while. But I want Daniel to, if you could start with reading a passage from the book.
So this is a passage about Egidio Balestrieri, who's a welder I met and worked with in Naples. Egidio Balestrieri had been a welder in Naples from childhood when he worked in his brother's shop. Before and after the Second World War, he worked at the Neapolitan shipyards, building and repairing damaged vessels, and in the 1950s, he opened a shop of his own in the industrial quarter. Egidio is a portly man with pinkish flesh who merrily breaks public ordinances and sings Neapolitan songs as he welds. We met one morning around 10 o'clock. Egidio had arrived dressed in a suit and tie and proceeded to change into his white workman's overalls. I parked Rocinante, my moped, next to the welding shop, but Egidio indicated with a hand gesture, a rapid movement of the fingers as if taking something, that it would be tempting thieves, so I led my steed into the shop. Egidio's workshop was small, with a fresh coat of paint. On the wall was an image of Santa Lucia, the patron saint of welders, who protects the eyes. 3 clients and idle proprietors of adjoining businesses were drinking coffee and gossiping in dialect by the door. Egidio consigned a newly mended engine block to a mechanic and his assistant, who loaded it into the back of their shaky Ape buggy and started off down the wrong way on a one-way street. A policeman wandered in to greet Egidio and gossip with the others, but Egidio brusquely ordered him out of the way, carrying a piece of incandescent steel and pincers out of doors. He quenched it in water amid crackling, boiling noise and rising clouds of steam. A 13-year-old girl, holding her younger sister's hand, walked past the shop and received a lascivious stare from the 6 men who had hitherto been gossiping. I had come straight from the foundry, bearing a large pod-like sculpture which needed to be welded. Egidio looked at me as though I were crazy. "Americana, the American," he exclaimed. Egidio's cronies watched me with guarded curiosity. Egidio's assistant dragged a perforated 50-gallon drum from the back, filled it with wood, and lit it with a welding torch. Egidio then grabbed the lip of the drum with pincers and dragged it across the street as cars zipped past him at high speeds. The assistant threw my sculpture in to let it preheat before welding and returned to help with other tasks. Egidio has a keen analytical mind. In precision welding, the most difficult task is preparing objects to be welded, ensuring that they don't move or shift under the heat of the torch. He prepares jigs, clamps, claws, and elaborate wiring systems to keep these objects still. For Egidio, welding is more like an instinctual function than a learned skill. He feels when the metal is nearly fluid, and with a subtle movement of his torch, draws it together, swirling and dancing beneath his flame. Egidio withdraws the torch, and the metal, as if deprived of life, chills, yielding its color and movement, becoming a dull, ashy seam. The pod-like sculpture glowed with warmth as Egidio's assistant lifted it onto the welding table with soaking towels. Steam hissed from the pod, filling the workshop with vapor, and Egidio set to work uniting the pieces. His brow was covered with beads of sweat, and his glasses, which had been fogged by vapor, became clear and lucid. He worked quickly, rotating the object as he welded with a wet towel. The workshop became a steamy nymphaeum, a cave-like womb. At last, the sculpture was finished, and the assistant carried it to the sidewalk to cool. Egidio cackled with delight and drank a demi-tasse of strong coffee.
It's
Yeah, that's what you do.
I won't get too literary critical here, but I just will say allegory. I won't be pedantic to even try to imagine what the allegory is of, but is this on?
You should try to be pedantic.
Just a little pedantic. Well, no, I want to. What is interesting is that, and also Benjamin in his essays wouldn't say this is a visit to the underworld in some way. It's a visit to the past, even though this person is living and this actually happened, but it's a sort of an ancient art that, Daniel, you are also an adept at, and that this is a scene of instruction, and you're learning this thing, and you could only receive this instruction here, and you've arrived at this point to receive the instruction, and you will go back to the new world and do something with what you've learned. So there's a glow of both pastness and of the emblem around it that I'm touched by.
I think what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read my paper, a little introduction, and I think we're going to switch seats so that I don't have to hold this, if you don't mind.
I love switching.
No, you don't. You'll just.
Oh,
Oh,
I
you
don't.
like switching?
No, I'll stay. I actually like staying put. I like everything.
It was bound to become faintly erotic.
Faintly.
Okay. Am I okay here? Good. So I want to start by thanking Brett Littman, the director of the Drawing Center, who has made this event possible, and Daniel Rothbart for inviting me to participate on this panel with the poet and critic Wayne Koestenbaum, and for Daniel's coordination of all the details, which are many. I would also like to make a few practical remarks about the circumstances surrounding the publication of Daniel's book. And here I am speaking on behalf of the other two co-publishers who are in attendance, Howard B. Johnson and Joy L. Glass. Edgewise Press has been publishing since 1995, which means the press has been in existence for over 20 years. This in a time when we see the exquisite near corpse of the book as Mallarmé's spiritual instrument dying a slow and hopefully a messy death. And this, given that the half-life of small presses in the United States is approximately 10 years, if that. Either this means our passing is overdue, or we must be doing something that is so culturally sublimated no one has bothered to declare our practice antiquated. Either way, we have, like Faulkner's character Dilsey at the end of The Sound and the Fury, simply persisted. So specifically, how did Daniel's book come about? He sent it to me for an endorsement, and instead I proposed we publish it, thinking it was exactly the kind of book Edgewise likes to publish. Well-written, unique, hopefully, in its point of view, and chances are unpublishable elsewhere. Plus, it consists of a network of interrelated essays, and essays, long or short, seem to be the thing we like to publish, in the spirit, I guess, of the French author and originator of the genre, Michel de Montaigne. But a better explanation is what I have called over the years publishing in cold blood. By this, I am obviously making an oblique reference to Capote's novel, In Cold Blood. Publishing in cold blood is what all writers dream of, a book that is published on its own merits, without any behind-the-scenes maneuverings, no tit-for-tat scenarios, or strings attached. You're out in the middle of nowhere, culturally speaking, in a dark, moonlit field at night, and the intruders enter, wreaking havoc, the boys in the novel and Eliot in his essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent. As a writer, I wish I could say this has happened more than once or twice in my lifetime. But when it happens, it is far from a bad thing, or rather, it is an inspired thing, which is not unlike accidentally happening upon a field of wildflowers in New Jersey, or an unimaginably exotic place during our unimaginably homogeneous lives, rather than purposefully seeking out the beauty of a garden or the solace and solitude of a safe place. Not exactly a bad thing, by the way. And it is certainly preferable to the ubiquitous parking lot that culture in its most static forms can become. In any case, it has been a privilege and an honor to publish Seeing Naples, a book driven by the purest and most genteel of wills to power, Daniel's passion in relation to every dimension of the book, from its conceptualization and textual and photographic realization to its physical materialization, has been scrupulous and unrelenting, and a charming thing to behold. I'm sure Francine feels the same, and she was there from the very beginning. I had forgotten what it was like for an author to care this much about a book. For this experience, I must thank Daniel again. Now I would like to make a few formal remarks about the book itself. If nothing else, reading Daniel's book makes you fall in love with writing. That is one of the greatest gifts any reading experience can give you. It is rare when you find a writer whose work is both sensuous and historical, capable of reaching into the soul, but also able to push beyond the ego's individual experience to embrace some state of being that is universal, or some set of circumstances that embody world, not simply as politics or ideology, not that these are not important, but world as spirit, and this rendered in the most alluring and seductive language possible. This is a book you not only want to publish, it is one you yourself would want to write. And then, of course, there is the place itself, Naples, and Daniel, in the book, motoring his way through the incomprehensible maze of streets and alleyways of the city during his year as a Fulbright scholar in 1991, which documani are reiterated by the adventure of his style, the sentential bloodstream of the book's formal structures, and the soulful complexity of the narrative. Daniel is that rare thing in the world of culture known as the artist writer, whose double-edged perceptions can reinvent a city, even one as incorrigible and enigmatic as Naples, a city that is eternal and ever-shifting, as palpable as its criminal elements and as resplendent as its sing-song inflections, and yet utterly elusive and insuperable. Spacca Napoli is as long and clear as day, and Neapolitan coffee, deep and rich as the night, is an elixir to the palate. Only modern-day Honduras comes close to its crime, and only Guatemala to its coffee. And only the darkest and most multivalent of Indian gods know it is a good idea to maintain as lucid and vigilant as possible. And only the darkest and most multivalent of gods, Indian gods, know it is a good idea to remain as lucid and vigilant as possible when traversing the history and experience of the Neapolitan people. Not to mention when you are trying to park your car in the city with the hopes of getting it back. Broken Italian, lots of cups of coffee, and abundant pizza are the bare minimum. After all, this is the city that has given us the comedian Toto and the medieval cosmologist Giordano Bruno, who one-upped Copernicus, theorizing infinite universes and exponentially anticipating Yeats's notion that no center anywhere could hold, urban or otherwise. This is why Daniel's book necessarily proceeds by epic fragments. This is the city where the convulsive and self-mesmerizing Tarantella was born, and the Enlightenment philosopher Giambattista Vico hypothesized history as a cyclical phenomenon, well in advance of Nietzsche's concept of eternal recurrence, and leading to the problematical postmodern idea of history as a chronic disorder. And finally, to the view of philosophy itself as nothing more than a form of historical distemperament, moving inexorably from category era to category era and reaching its apotheosis with Heidegger's linguistic rigor mortis. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy necrophiliac forms of intellectual self-indulgence, although I feel a bit queasy about rebuilding the foundations of civilization based upon an etymological flourish. This is why Daniel's book had to proceed by dissonant lyrical narratives that seem to have taken a page right out of Mahler's cosmic playbook, especially his Third and Ninth Symphony. Things that don't go together in any prescribed way often seem to have a better chance of surviving than things whose destiny are supposedly fated. This is, after all, the city of Pulcinella, the universal spirit of common man dancing a metaphysical jig, whose not-so-hidden motive was to make us, as universal Neapolitans, die laughing, and the city where the idealist philosopher Benedetto Croce literally died, the philosopher who was nominated 16 times for the Nobel Prize but never won, the philosopher and where Giacomo Leopardi expired, the only sonneteer who took himself more seriously than John Berryman. Well, let's not forget the likes of Thomas Hardy and Edward Arlington Robinson. Sonneteers or no, John Berryman, the ultimate Puccinella, that intoxicating blend of King Lear and Falstaff, born in Minnesota, like Dylan, not Naples. This is why there is nothing and no one the author of Seeing Naples will not embrace, assimilate, enable, allowing the city itself, like Joyce's Dublin, to tell its own story. Be the storytellers, highwaymen, filmmakers, printmakers, foundrymen, welders, alchemists, princes, fishmongers, communists, philosophers, Holocaust survivors. Naples is the city of the other crooner, Enrico Caruso, who never let us forget that somewhere inside or along the arc of that overarching voice cowered the poor urchin and street singer of his youth. Naples, the most bombed city in Italy during World War II. Even if Palermo is perhaps the only city in the world where you can still see in the main streets, not just in the Vicoli, to this very day, unbelievably enough, more than just remnants of the buildings and the rubble of those buildings devastated areas bombed in that war. You literally can go down several streets right off the main drag and see remnants of the Second World War, unbelievably enough. This is why Daniel's book is steeped in history as an emotional construct and is not merely the intellectual exponent of any predetermined ideology. And this is precisely what our guide and narrator, Daniel Rothbart, does. Our Virgil in Dante's Inferno exfoliates in a most affectionate and recondite manner the solar underworld of what we think we are seeing presently, or thought we saw before, historically, in a game of perception akin to three-card Monte, whose ultimate motive is the transaction of metaphysical futures. Only an artist who is also a writer, or a writer who is also an artist, can do this. Or, as Hannah Arendt once said of Walter Benjamin, in a string of negations which I have always admired and found inspirational and worthy of Neapolitan and Sicilian fatalism, quote, to describe adequately his work and him as author within our usual framework of reference, one would have to make a great many negative statements, such as, his erudition was great, but he was no scholar. His subject comprised texts and their interpretation, but he was no philologist. He was greatly attracted not by religion, but by theology and the theological type of interpretation for which the text itself is sacred, but he was no theologian, and he was not particularly interested in the Bible. He was born a writer, but his greatest ambition was to produce a work consisting entirely of quotations. He was the first German to translate Proust, together with Franz Hessel and St. John Perse, and before that, he had translated Baudelaire's Tableau Parisien, but he was no translator. He reviewed books and wrote a number of essays on living and dead writers, but he was no literary critic. He wrote a book about the German Baroque and left behind a huge, unfinished study of the French 19th century, what we have come to know as his Arcades Project, but was no historian, literary or otherwise. I shall try to show, Arendt says, that he thought poetically, but he was neither a poet nor a philosopher, unquote. One of the most beautiful pieces of writing by Hannah Arendt, who herself was an amazing intellectual. There's so many people who are, myself among them, readily reach for Walter Benjamin like a loaded pistol, but not very many people reach for the ladies from that time. Wayne says as much when he describes our motorinoist, which is a neologism, I think, as, quote, primarily a visual artist, but his visual encounters can take the form of photographs, of digital collages, of aluminum sculptures, of manuscripts, of research projects, of ceremonies, of videos, of bronze and terracotta artifacts, and of numinous atmospheres which take the sanctified and sensual tonalities of Walter Pater's La Gioconda and wed them to a mysticism refined by diaspora into minimalist condensations, unquote. We have a number of beautiful writers here. In this context, we must not overlook the related fact that Daniel is also the author of Jewish Metaphysics as Generative Principle in American Art, specifically American Abstract Expressionism. Perhaps it is not so strange, after all, that a Jewish Buddhist would also write a so-called travel book, Seeing Naples, seemingly channeling the ancient Library of Alexandria, documenting the Alberghi dei Poveri, a rebellion against the Spanish viceroy in defiance of exploitative taxation, Naples' first communist mayor, and a revolt against Nazi occupiers. Some travel book. We will never know much or how much or how little the Kabbalah has played in the author's renderings of the mysteries of Naples. Before I corner myself into the identity of a fellow serial citationist, let me conclude by saying there have been many so-called travel writers before. Among them, we must count Lawrence Stern, Goethe, Tobias Smollett, Lawrence Durrell, Freya Stark, and there is, of course, more pertinent here, Norman Douglas and his book on Naples, Siren Land, A Celebration of Life in Southern Italy. And who can forget books with such startling titles as Bitter Lemons, Their Heads Are Green and Their Hands Are Blue, Ghost Trains to the Eastern Star. And we must not forget that other motorinoist, Che Guevara, who recorded his humble but self-revelatory journey through the Americas on a motorcycle. And there are, needless to say, T.E. Lawrence's 7 Pillars of Wisdom, which most of us have seen in CinemaScope, if not read, and Gertrude Bell's book on Syria and the Middle East, The Desert and the Sown, perhaps even more pertinent at this moment in history. And of course, I am omitting such well-known writers as Henry James, E.M. Forrester, Stendhal, Somerset Maugham, Italo Calvino, and Aldous Huxley. But on Naples, per se, we can always consult Daniel's list of further readings at the end of the book. However, now we must add to this distinguished list of journeyists, and my hope is that this will be your opinion as well, Daniel Rothbart, with his simultaneously rarefied and visceral opus, Seeing Naples, Reports from the Shadow of Vesuvius. Thank you. Would you like to read another passage, or would you like?
Well, I don't know. Do you want to? Did you have anything to add?
I mean, I'm absorbing all the. You should read a passage now, and then we'll discuss.
Right. Maybe the Driving Rossino.
Yeah.
Yeah. You want to switch again? Good.
Yeah.
I love the switching thing.
Driving Rocinante from the Valmero to the station. Sunlight was dancing over the stucco, cobblestones, and gardens of Naples in the early morning. I drove Rocinante from the upper city down winding streets to Corso Vittorio Emanuele, passing caves of tuffo stone. I had noticed one morning in the real estate section of the newspaper the following offering: caves for rent, 15,000 square feet of fine tuffo caves available. Prices are negotiable. Allied bombings left many homeless during the Second World War, and the network of caves served as temporary living quarters for some families well into the 1950s. A bit further on was the mouth of the Tunnel of the 4 Days of Naples, which cuts through Mount Posillipo to Mussolini's neighborhood of the future, Fuorigrotta. It is more than half a mile long, dark and poorly ventilated, making it a rather unpleasant passage with Rocinante. Deep potholes would cause the motorino to bounce up and down, and at times it was necessary to dodge garbage that motorists had thrown into the street. All the while, large blowers were recycling air. They looked like the remnants of an early airplane that had been attached to the black viscera of the tunnel. Cars shot past as I gunned Rocinante's feeble motor in the hope of escaping quickly from this asphyxiating atmosphere. With a sense of relief, I turned away from the mouth of the tunnel, casting a furtive glance at the tombs of Leopardi and Virgil. While driving with a Neapolitan friend, we once passed Virgil's tomb, and he remarked, "To think the poor devil wound up here, next to festering billows of car exhaust." Indeed, this ancient Roman poet who led Dante into the mouth of hell found his last resting place near a similar orifice. In all probability, the blackened little tumulus doesn't belong to Virgil at all, but to some hapless Roman patrician who lived during the reign of Augustus and found himself buried beside a modern highway by happenstance. Not so Leopardi, who died during the 1837 cholera epidemic. During this period, all bodies, including those of people who hadn't been afflicted by cholera, were thrown into common graves and disposed of with quicklime. Antonio Ranieri, a friend of the poet, obtained permission to have him buried in the church of San Vitale di Fuorigrotta, where Leopardi's body was spirited away at midnight and remained until 1844, when it was transferred to a modest tomb outside the church, erected by Ranieri. During the fascist regime, Leopardi's remains were transferred once again, this time to a statelier tomb next to the tumulus of Virgil at the mouth of the tunnel. Down I sped, along Via Caracciolo to the seaside, where waves crashed over concrete pylons and sea spray wafted through the air onto my body. On turning a corner, I found myself before the beautiful Castel dell'Ovo, or Castle of the Egg. It is an ancient castle of golden tuffo stone that rests on an island some 100 yards offshore, connected to the mainland by a spit of land that was constructed by Alfonso I of Aragon in the 15th century. Its name refers to a legend that Virgil placed an egg on the foundation of the castle, declaring that if this egg were ever to break, Naples would be destroyed by the sea. In 1370, the castle was awash during a fierce tempest. Queen Giovanna I, with typical Neapolitan resourcefulness, decided to place a fresh egg in a passageway of the castle, and the storm abated.
The most lovable thing about the book is it Rocinante? Rocinante, the moped?
The moped.
The moped, and worth the price, the very modest price of the book, given how lustrous, even the typeface is worth, just to look at the typeface, you should be charged $35. Forget that you even take it serious. The typeface is not to be believed. No book published in the United States has such an esoterically sourced typeface. And this is not exaggerating. I'm going to get to a point about Rocinante, but meanwhile.
Let me interrupt with just a small parenthesis. That's all due to Daniel. I put the mere idea in his brain that we should, on a book on Naples, we should have typography that related to Neapolitan typography, the history of typography, which is such an illustrious and wonderful one. He actually found, he collects books, and in those books he happened to have a book that represented late 17th century, early 18th century typography. He had to literally photograph each of the letters in the particular face that Daniel chose, not I, that Daniel chose, and then had to reconstruct all of that into making all of these headers and the various portions of the book that are in this typeface himself. It took great detail, great patience, and dedication. And this is what I meant earlier when I said I really admire Daniel, not just as an author, but really as an artist, because it was really about putting the book physically together.
Yeah, that's the great thing about when I beheld the book, as it's the large object of it, and seeing that typeface, again, the thematics of reanimation and seance that you had literally recreated on a modern technology, this earlier typeface. But so the beautiful thing about Rocinante, and worth the price of admission to the book, is the photo of Daniel. The younger Daniel is still young, but the even younger, let's just say it's like, is it Tadzio? Is that the boy? You know, I mean, it's just, yeah, I mean, just like an apparition on his allegorical moped. And what's so beautiful about the book, because it both takes place in the moment, in the past, of Daniel being in Naples, and it's a slowly unfolding, retrospective self-portrait of the younger Daniel. And so that the twinning of the more mature voice that the book now has after the span of years, and that rebel without a cause on his moped. But the thing about it is the tenderest relationship in the book is, I think, and it's the magic vehicle. It's sort of like Dorothy's slippers in Oz, or like, it's the magic device that allows Daniel to navigate the impossible, non-consensual streets of Naples. Non-consensual because nobody obeys. Nobody obeys. But with moped, you can travel. So it's I'm glad you read that ode to your former self on this fugitive instrument, this ship. So.
We have to close on that beautiful note.
Okay, we'll close there, but we have quite.
Oh, just one thing. We might want to ask you wonderful people who are patient and made an effort to get here. If you have any questions or would care to make any comments or expose us in any way, we're like really incredibly open to that idea. Peter, you're laughing. By the way, I just want to mention, and I'll take your question in a second. I was talking about artists, writers, artists, and what a special kind of individual that is. And Peter Howley's sitting in the audience, and his texts, which we've had the honor of publishing and keeping in print for over 20 years with Edgewise, his texts were helped to define an era in the art world. We're very privileged to have been able to have been a part of that joy, and Howard and myself. You had a question?
Yeah, so in your interactions when you were in there, are you speaking in Italian, speaking English, and as well as taking notes for your notes only in English, or how did you translate these experiences and these conversations with another language?
Well, I definitely, I spoke some Italian before arriving, but then it was a complete immersion because you can't, certainly at that time you needed to, the only way you could communicate was through Italian. And interestingly, I suppose I started to conceive the book through interactions with people. Like I met this man who had such a fascinating, a Holocaust survivor who was living in Pozzuoli, by the seashore in an abandoned building, basically. But he told me this extraordinary narrative of his life and the various, all of this odyssey through Europe during the war years and being captured. So, and escaping all these close calls with the Germans and collaborators, finding his way ultimately to southern Italy and the beautiful town of Pozzuoli, of course, in a very marginal, way. I mean, his existence was pretty, difficult, but at the same time, he wanted to stop running, and he felt very, content to live out his life in that place. And I started, and he had beautiful, photographs of, of this, documenting this story. So I had them photographed in Naples, and I did intend to write about it at some point. So somewhere in my mind, I was thinking about the book.
Any other questions? Yes.
Daniel, are you still in touch with the people that wrote about it, and have they read any?
Very much so. Very much so, yes. Actually, I developed two very close friendships in Naples, Riccardo Notte and Francesco Lucrezia. And actually, we're planning to launch the book in Naples in the fall. Probably in two places. The Valenzi Foundation, the communist mayor, passed away. He was very old. He passed away, and a foundation was created to support his ongoing vision in a castle on the Castel Nuovo. So that's a wonderful venue. And also the Museo di Capodimonte may also host a book signing and reading. So.
I have a question. Daniel, following up on what Wayne said, 30 years later, what's going to be your next book?
I don't know if I have another book in me. This was such a wonderful question, but I'll have to reflect. It might be another 25 years of him.
Okay, wonderful to have you all here. We thank you so much for being here, and